of Vente, Mundo in Washington, D.C. We're a part of Vente, Venezuela that believes in freedom, private property, and democracy and capitalism. So, of course, we have you here as a special guest. Joseph Humire is the Executive Director for Secure Free Society, and he is an expert on trans-regional threats in the Latin American and the Middle East. So tonight is basically about the COVID-19 and the war that is coming with United States and China. Is basically a biological war because no bullet has been fired, not even a single bullet. So I want to know where Venezuela stands in this situation because we somehow been left behind in the back burner. So what is your thoughts regarding this global pandemic and the Venezuela situation?
Okay. Well, first, let me just say thank you to everybody that's watching, and apologize for all the technical problems. Apparently, we don't have a technical challenge here, but nonetheless, I'm glad everybody's here. Thank you again, Rena, for having me. Thank you, Maria Karina, Vente, Venezuela. I've always been a follower, and obviously I've always had a lot of respect and admiration for Maria Karina and her leadership in Venezuela. So to the question, COVID-19, yeah. So this is a challenge, right? This is a challenge for every country in the world. I think the biggest challenge with the coronavirus has been to understand the true origin and the true characteristics of the virus. The problem is when the virus began, it came from China. And China, as we now know, has not been very honest about the characteristics of the virus or about when it actually started. So we first learned about the virus sometime in mid to late January. And at that time, the kind of messaging that was given was that it didn't have human-to-human transmission. So that's a big, major detail. To say that the virus cannot be transmitted from people to people essentially makes it less contagious and less worrisome. So when they said that, and that was something that China had initially said, that was echoed by the World Health Organization. When that happened, I think that confused most of the health authorities throughout the world. And then the second was exactly where the virus came from. We initially believed that the virus came from a wet market down in Wuhan, in the province of Wuhan in China. However, over time, we've learned that it most likely did not come from the wet market, and perhaps came from a biological safety lab where they were experimenting with biological viruses. So in any kind of virus, any kind of pandemic, what they call patient zero, the first patient, is very important. That kind of determines how you can understand the chain of sequencing to know how the contagion and the spread can grow. And so we didn't have this information early on. And because we didn't, and not just us, I mean, the world didn't have this information early on. And because we didn't have this information, it naturally put us behind. But in the time that the world was trying to catch up to understanding this new novel coronavirus, China essentially didn't waste any time, and they escalated and amplified their propaganda. Essentially, what I think what China did to capitalize on the time, on that head start that it had, was it essentially established a line of propaganda. And this line of propaganda had two levels. One level was to accuse the United States of actually being involved or being the origin of the virus. If you guys remember, the Chinese communications ministry and some of its ambassadors had actually directly accused the United States. They said they speculated that this virus could have originated from the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army had somehow implanted the virus in China. So that was a very aggressive accusation, and China's propaganda usually isn't that aggressive, so it caught a lot of people by surprise. And then the second part of the propaganda, the second level of the propaganda, is to do a lot of damage control and PR to paint China not as the source of the problem, as we believe it is, but to paint them as the solution to the virus. And so a massive, robust medical diplomacy effort has been launched throughout the world, and that's where I think it hits Latin America, and including in Venezuela, because in Latin America you've seen a very aggressive effort to both convince Latin Americans that China is part of the solution to the coronavirus by offering medical aid, in some cases by offering materials and supplies, and they do this through partnerships in the region. And one of their main partners is Maduro in Venezuela. In fact, one of the only countries that I know about that has actually received medical doctors from China in Latin America is Maduro in Venezuela. And I think that's part of the propaganda effort. And they do it in conjunction with Cuba. Cuba has also basically tag teamed with China to essentially offer their medical support to many countries around the world. To kind of do this 1-2 punch to say that Cuba and China is the solution to the coronavirus, when in reality China likely was the problem. It's the source of the problem, and their lack of transparency essentially caused the world to get weeks, if not months, behind on the pandemic.
So Venezuela is basically a little break on all this. They're basically put them on the back burner, and we wanted to see if somehow we're going to be on the main news again, like we used to. But this other question that I have for you is basically regarding the Maduro regime and the connections to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay.
What is your opinion about the multiple aircrafts belonging to Mayhem Air transferring unknown support items to the Maduro regime? And is this going to affect Venezuela in many ways? And is Hezbollah becoming a powerful group in Venezuela with a direct threat to the U.S.?
Okay, so Iran and Venezuela. So I knew we were going to touch on this topic. This is obviously, for those here in the United States, this has been one of the focal points on Venezuela over the last month or so. And just as way of context, so everyone's kind of up to date, since April 22nd, there has been regular flights coming from Iran to Venezuela from this Iranian airline called Mahan Air. So just so everyone understands what Mahan Air is. Mahan Air is an airline that's been sanctioned by the United States since 2011. The reason it's been sanctioned by the United States is because this is the specific airline. While it's a private airline, ostensibly a private airline, it was an airline that was used by Iran's clerical army, the Revolutionary Guards. It was used by the Revolutionary Guards to send supplies, to send armament, to send support and troops, military folks, to Syria to support the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria during their civil war. So it was sanctioned initially for that reason. Moving forward, we also found that this was the same airline that moved the same kind of supplies and military logistical support to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, another civil conflict down in the Middle East, over in the Middle East. And so this same airline, Mahan Air, is now arriving in Venezuela. And since April 22nd, there's been no fewer than 17 flights that have come in and out of Venezuela. A lot of them have arrived into Paraguanan Peninsula on the northern border of Venezuela with the Caribbean coast. Some other flights, my understanding, go straight to Caracas in Maiquetía, in the capital of Venezuela. And I've even heard rumors that some flights have gone to Margarita Island, although I haven't been able to confirm that. Nonetheless, what we've learned so far, at least publicly through journalists and media reporting, is that these flights come down and they work on the oil refineries in Venezuela through an energy agreement that Iran has with Venezuela. They run back to Iran with gold. They have taken, I think, upwards of almost $1 billion worth of gold bars from Venezuela's central bank and send it back to Tehran. So that's what we know in terms of this is what the Iranians have said, this is what Maduro has admitted, and this is what journalists have reported. But I think the key with most things that are related to Iran is the key is what we don't know. What are they doing behind the scenes and beneath the surface? I've said this in different interviews. I'm more concerned not with what Iran's taking out of Venezuela, which I do believe that they're taking all this gold out of Venezuela, but I'm not as concerned as what they're taking out of Venezuela, as opposed to I'm more concerned of what they're bringing into Venezuela. In that area where they're flying to the Paraguaná Peninsula, in the refineries in Humire and Punta Cordon in the Paraguaná refinery complex, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, the same ones that were fighting in Syria, the same ones in Iraq, the same ones in Yemen, they have been in Venezuela for at least 10 to 12 or more years at that specific refinery. We have known that because of the companies that the Iranians have been using to do all kinds of different types of bilateral cooperation on energy, but they turned out to be more military in nature. So the question then becomes is what kind of dual-use capability is Iran implementing inside the Paraguaná refinery complex in Venezuela, and to what intention and what purpose? And what my concern is, my biggest worry when it comes to this, Iran and Venezuela, is we already know what Iran wants to, what Iran can and wants to do in the Middle East with the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. They've attacked oil ships They've shot at U.S. naval vessels and naval assets. They have shot down our drones. They have antagonized in acts of aggression against the United States Navy and against U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf along the Strait of Hormuz. So my biggest concern is that Iran would build a similar capability to be able to antagonize the U.S. Navy and our allies in the Venezuelan coast all the way to the Panama Canal. Now, I'm not saying that Iran has that capability as it stands right now, but that's why I'm concerned of what they're bringing into Venezuela. Because are they going to bring in electronic equipment, surveillance equipment, intelligence equipment to be able to do these kind of operations in the Caribbean, in the Western Hemisphere? That is a concern, I think, that not only for myself, but for every country in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the countries that are bordering along that Caribbean area in Central and South America.
Yeah, and that is basically amazing. What is the power that Iran has in Venezuela? I have another question regarding this Operation Gideon, where two former American Green Bearers were apprehended by the Maduro regime. So we know that this was a coup, that it didn't go anywhere, and basically we have right now two American citizens being detained by this regime. What are your thoughts on this?
On the operation, on Gideon?
On Gideon operation and the result of it, which is basically
yeah. So I've been asked. No, I understand. So I've been asked about this a lot. I've been asked quite a bit actually over the last few days, over the last week. This is something that I think really caught a lot of people by surprise. Not that there was something like this being planned. I mean, I'm sure many people. I heard rumors of Venezuelan military exiles, defectors being trained on some. You hear these rumors, but you never know what's actually going to happen. You never know, or more importantly, you don't know when it's going to happen. So when this took place last Sunday, I believe on May 3rd, I was caught by surprise. And more than I was caught by surprise, more than the actual mission, like the fact that there was a group of Venezuelan military mercenaries that were coming into Venezuela and trying to execute this mission. More than the actual mission, what I was surprised by what was the kind of like the nature of the operation, because it didn't seem to be an operation that would have a high chance of success. From what I could understand of the operation, I think the raid into La Guaira port, into the port La Guaira in Macuto, I think that was nothing more than a catalyst to try to spark an internal military rebellion. So this is something that I think a lot of Venezuelans think is important to be able to flip the tide on Nicolas Maduro. They want to spark this internal military revolt, turn the military against Maduro, have the military back Juan Guaido or back any opposition element, and make a launch to be able to turn the balance of power away from Nicolas Maduro. Now, I think that what was intended was that these military or what you want to call military mercenaries, paramilitary elements, that they would come into Venezuela and most likely either get killed or detained or destroyed by the regime. But that image, that narrative would then spark other military elements from within Venezuela to rise up. But it didn't happen. And matter of fact, all the individuals of that operation got detained. I believe additional people were detained today. And so what that leads me to believe is this operation was failed from the start. That this was never had a high chance of success, and principally not just because of the strategy around the operation, but also because a high probability that the infiltration or the people that were involved in the operation were infiltrated, that they were already connected through backdoor channels or through secretive networks to the Maduro regime itself. And so that's where I called into question one of the ringleaders of this operation, maybe not the specific operation that took place last Sunday, but the actual idea of doing something similar to this, which was a major general named Clever Alcalá. So Clever Alcalá is, he's well known to Venezuelans, right? For everyone that's watched the Chavez years and the Bolivarian Revolution, he was one of those original military figures that was very close to Hugo Chavez. He came from the coup in '92, or the attempted coup in '92, where Hugo Chavez became notable to the Venezuelan people. that movement that they call the 4F movement, the Cuatro de Febrero, that failed coup movement. He's part of that original group. And so he rises through the ranks. He becomes general, and he controls very strategic parts of Venezuela. He controls the Guyana area. He becomes a commander, a regional commander for Guyana. He also becomes a military commander in Zulia. And so he has a lot of connections, and most importantly, he gets embedded with the narco state. He gets embedded with the criminal connections. So when he decides to defect from Venezuela, he defects from the regime sometime in 2013 or 14. It's not clear to me when, but he defects from the regime. He says, I'm no longer with the Bolivarian regime. I'm no longer with Hugo Chavez died. I'm not with Nicolas Maduro. And then he defects from Venezuela. He leaves from Venezuela in 2018 and goes to Colombia. But when he comes over to Colombia, what drew my attention was if he was legitimately a defector, then why was his family still connected to nefarious elements that were tied to the regime? Most notably, his brother. So when he was defecting from Venezuela to Colombia, away from the Maduro regime, his brother was being courted diplomatically to be Maduro's envoy to Iran. And so Clever Alcala went to Colombia in 2018. Carlos Alcala, his brother, went to Tehran in early 2019 and got credentialed as the Maduro regime's diplomat or ambassador to that country. And anyone knows that is not a normal. That's not just any run-of-the-mill country that gets appointed an ambassador. That is a strategic ally. That is much a strategic ally as getting appointed ambassador to Cuba and getting appointed ambassador to Russia, to China. These are the key countries that support and prop up the Maduro regime. So what was confusing to me was you have one brother that's in Iran working with Maduro, and you have another brother in Colombia working against Maduro. And so is blood thicker than water, or what's going on here? So that drew a lot of questions for me even before this raid happened. So once the raid happens and we find out, it gets botched, it doesn't work, and you gotta ask those questions. You gotta find out, was Clever Alcala setting this mission up for failure since the beginning? Did he convince these Venezuelans that this is the way to get rid of Maduro, knowing well that this wasn't going to work, and sent them essentially on a suicide mission to their own demise? And so now we have all these Venezuelans captured and detained, but even just equally concerning, we have now 2 Americans, former Green Berets, that are detained in Venezuelan prisons.
So I wanted to ask you something about BRIC. It seems to be shifting from a sanction invasion to a sanction resistant strategic. So first of all, can you tell us what BRIC stands for?
Yeah, absolutely. So just so everyone knows, I direct a think tank here in Washington, D.C. It's called the Center for Secure Free Society, and we're a national security think tank. And so we look at something that the Defense Department calls trans-regional threats. We look at threats that exist in one part of the world, such as the Middle East, and that move quickly into other parts of the world, such as Latin America, or and vice versa. So we look and examine these threats on a daily basis, and we analyze them, and we kind of write reports, do publications, briefings, the typical work that a think tank does. And in that work, we've been around for now about 8 years, and in this time, I've constantly seen an alliance forming. Alliance of not just non-state networks of criminals and terrorists, but also an alliance of nation states that support these illicit networks. Certain countries, rogue regimes that use organized crime and use international terrorism as a tool of statecraft, as a way to advance their foreign policy objectives. And so in that we looked at these 4 countries: Russia, Iran, China, and Venezuela. So I think it was last year, we decided to create a report, a monitor that looks every month, that analyzes the activities that Russia, Iran, and China do in Latin America. Because while the U.S. national security community and other security communities in other parts of the world, they tend to look at Russia, Iran, and China in their own regions, like what's Iran doing in the Middle East. I think that's a lot of point of discussion here in Washington. Or what's China doing in the South China Sea or in the Asia Pacific, Russia and Ukraine, or in the Baltics. So these kind of discussions are part of the mainstream conversation in national security here in the United States. But these countries, Russia, Iran, and China, and Latin America, has not been enough of a discussion at a high level here in Washington. So what we decided to do was create this term. And so the term is BRIC, with a V, as in Venezuela, BRIC, which helps to symbolize this alliance that's been forming for almost 2 decades now. And it's a play off of the old term, the BRIC, which was a term coined by Jim O'Neill, Goldman Sachs term, that looked at emerging economies. What happens when Brazil, Russia, India, and China become to align in an economic alliance of emerging markets. That was the term back in the early 20th century that they used to talk about an emerging economic alliance. It never really planned out. I mean, Brazil hasn't really emerged into a tier 2 status economically. Russia's economy is not doing good. China, India, etc. So what we said is that alliance doesn't seem to be very successful. But there's another alliance behind, a separate alliance that's called the BRIC, which is Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China. That's not an economic alliance, but that is a intelligence and security alliance, a cooperation, much like the United States has cooperation with something called the Five Eyes. So on the intelligence level, the United States cooperates with Canada, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia in a way over and above our intelligence cooperation with other countries. And so these 4 countries, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China, have a similar intelligence cooperation among them so that they know what's going on throughout the world at any given moment. So we started to focus on that. And the best way to do that was to do a report. So we publish a monthly report on our website called the BRIC Monitor, and it covers country by country what Russia, Iran, and China are doing throughout Latin America. And what you do is when you start to track that regularly, you find that they're doing a lot. And a lot of what they're doing is aimed at destabilizing Latin America and delegitimizing the United States.
Yeah, I do have another question for you. And this is basically something that happened a day after the Gideon operation. And I want to hear your opinion. Story.
Okay. It broke up a little bit.
That because
the audio broke up. Was it?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, go ahead. I could.
Yes.
I hear you now.
Yes, I wanted to ask you something. Well, a day after the Gideon operation, there was a James Story designation. I mean, the U.S. designated James Story as an ambassador to Venezuela. And that was a day after the Gideon operation. I just want to know your opinion. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, James Story is a career diplomat. He's been involved in Latin America and Venezuela for a very long time. I believe he was with International Narcotics and Labor, which is what they call, kind of in colloquial terms, the Drugs and Thugs Department of the State Department that looks at anti-narcotic operations. So he has an understanding of that part of policy, the anti-narcotics. I believe he was the charge of affairs in the U.S. Embassy in Caracas for a time being, which is a position not equivalent to an ambassador, but it's in that same level in the sense that we, in a country that doesn't recognize our diplomatic standing, we have a charge A. So he's a career official, and he's been running something called the Venezuela Affairs Unit. That's based out in Bogota. That basically is the team that looks at Venezuela on a day-to-day basis for the U.S. State Department. So for me, his appointment is kind of a continuity to U.S. policy on Venezuela. I think the State Department has been establishing a policy on Venezuela for a long time that has to do with kind of a carrot and stick approach. The sticks are the sanctions, or the economic pressure, the diplomatic pressure, basically establishing a stranglehold on the revenue streams inside Venezuela to try to choke out the Maduro regime from being able to sustain itself. And the carrots are what was presented, I think, about a month ago now by Secretary Pompeo, which was this thing they call the Democratic Transition Framework, which to create essentially a council that would oversee a transition for Venezuela into elections that would not include Juan Guaido and would not include Nicolas Maduro. So I think appointing James Story as the official ambassador to Venezuela, to me, signals that the United States is going to move in that direction. Now, the question that comes to me, and Irina, I don't know if this was implied in your question, but if the question that comes to me is this the right strategy? Is this the right direction to go? And so what I'll say to that is, let me start by saying this. The Trump administration has done more for Venezuela than the previous 3 or 4 or 5 administrations over the last 30 years. more than the Obama, way more than the Obama administration, more than the Bush administration, more than the Clinton administration, and I'd argue say even more than the Reagan administration. Obviously, Reagan was focused more on the Cold War and on the proxy wars that were happening in Central America. So Venezuela hasn't got this level of attention in probably ever. So the Trump administration, since day one, has been trying to figure out how to solve the Venezuelan problem, how to liberate the Venezuelan people, and how to create peace and prosperity in a country that hasn't seen that in more than 20 years. So I think with that, let me say that the intentions, whether it's James Story, whether it's the Special Envoy Ellie Abrams, or the National Security Council Director Mauricio Claver-Carone, or anybody that's appointed by President Trump to hold a position on Venezuela, I think has done this with the best of intentions. That said, I think Venezuela is a complicated challenge. It is probably the most complicated challenge in the world. In this era of what they call great power competition, this is the era that we're living in today. If you read the national security strategy of the United States, the first line it talks about is we're living in an era of great power competition, which means it's not just the United States by ourselves. We now are competing with Russia. We're competing with China. And we're fighting adversaries such as Iran and North Korea. So in this era of great power competition, Venezuela to me seems like the most complicated problem set in that GPC. And so with that, I should say that I don't think it's surprising that a lot of strategies have not worked. But I do believe that the strategies currently implied by the State Department aren't I would say seeing the full strategic picture inside Venezuela, because they're focused on frameworks and they're focused on premises that are different from what the reality is on the ground. So that's my position on this. But I wanted to make clear that it's in no way, I think, a knock on the administration or a knock on any individual within the administration, but because this is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and we are very thankful with Mr. President Trump. He has worked so hard to give Venezuela the freedom that it deserves, you know. So, well, thank you so much, Joseph, for giving us your time. And we really look forward to have you in the next interview or so that we're going to have. And if you wanted to mention your Twitter account so people can start following you on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you're watching this, you have my Twitter account, which is at Humire. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm being more active on Twitter than I used to. I've been accused of being ghost on Twitter, to not tweet as much as I should, and it's true. I mean, I direct a think tank, so I don't always have the time. But I promise that I'm going to be more active on Twitter. Also on Instagram, it's the same handle. It's at Humire. So I'm definitely going to get more involved. I also, if you
have a question.
A radio show.
Yeah, we have a question
yeah.
from the Arians.
Okay.
It says here, let me see. Iran can mine uranium in Venezuela and develop enrichment capabilities and it's possible anytime soon. That's what they're saying. Let me see this question here. Because
so was the question about Iran mining uranium in Venezuela?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so I know a little bit about this. I've been looking at that for a long time. So Iran absolutely studied the uranium inside Venezuela. You know, as you know, imagine many people know, Venezuela has one of the largest deposits of uranium in the Western Hemisphere. It's been compared to the uranium deposits in the Athabasca region in Canada, which are very known deposits of uranium and one of the largest in the world. So, but much like a lot of natural resources, Iran's very rich in uranium. The problem with the uranium in Venezuela, the problem with uranium in Venezuela is it hasn't been historically exploited, meaning there wasn't an industry that was actually taking the mineral out of the ground. The Canadians had studied it, the Australians had studied it, but so what happened is Iran came in around 2006, 2007, and they came in and they did all the geological studies of the uranium mines for the Chavez government, the Chavez regime in Venezuela. What I believe is they developed sophisticated ways to pull the uranium out of the ground but in a way that wouldn't be detected by or wouldn't be able to be proven by international regulatory bodies. Now, the question is, what would they do with this uranium? Because Iran doesn't need uranium from Venezuela for its nuclear program. It's got enough uranium from other parts of the world, including Russia, including South Africa. So why would it actually need to go to this risk to able to support Venezuela or to exploit the Venezuelan uranium? And my answer to that is, I'm not sure the uranium that exists in Venezuela, if it's used for nuclear purposes, would be used for any kind of program in Iran. I think we need to look very carefully at programs in Latin America. And to that, I'll point you to a couple. I'll point you to Cuba, and I'll point you to Bolivia. I think both of those countries have ongoing nuclear ambitions, and obviously they collaborate with one another. And the one that's most advanced has been the Bolivian nuclear program. Now, the good news is the Bolivian government is no longer under the control of Evo Morales, a very Maduro and Chavez ally. It's now under control of President Ginny Náñez, who is trying to turn the country to a transition. But I believe one of the things that we have to do is we have to look at these nuclear ambitions, we have to look at these uranium markets, and we have to understand to separate fact from fiction. So with that, I will say that I think Iran has studied, absolutely 100% studied the uranium mines in Venezuela. I don't know for certain that they've exploited that mineral, but I know that it's possible that they could have. And let me just add one more thing to that. Uranium is only one mineral that would be beneficial to any kind of strategic WMD program from Iran. There are other minerals in Venezuela that have also a military-grade application. One to be very paid attention to is thorium. And I believe Iran has been prospecting thorium all throughout South America, including in Venezuela and in Brazil and in Bolivia, and tantalum as well. So these aren't the only. So uranium is not the only mineral that Iran's been after. I think they've been after other minerals in Latin America as well.
Yeah, and as we know, we have the Hezbollah becoming a powerful group in Venezuela, with basically a direct threat to the United States. They will probably going to start machinating things and becoming bigger and bigger. And as the issue gets bigger, it's going to be a huge problem, not only for the United States, but for the Western Hemisphere too.
Oh, we were talking about Hezbollah right before I hung up. So let me say something on Hezbollah. So Hezbollah works through networks, and I think this is one of the things that's been difficult. Oh, here we go. Let's see if we get our friend back. Rena, you there? Okay, cool. I was just saying something on Hezbollah real quick that you mentioned it. So I think Hezbollah has been one of those complicated things for most Venezuelan opposition members to understand when it comes to Venezuela, because it's essentially invisible. We hear about Hezbollah in Venezuela for many years now, but no one's actually seen it. And the problem with that is, I think, is the way Hezbollah operates. Hezbollah is intrinsically a secretive organization. They're not like ISIS, where they chase headlines all around the world. They naturally try to stay very low profile, even in Lebanon, the country where they're from. And so Hezbollah works through networks. They work through support networks, and these support networks have layers. Some are financial, some are logistical, some are even operational. And so these support networks, while you look, they can't. You wouldn't say that they're members of Hezbollah per se, but they're supporters of Hezbollah that provide capabilities to Hezbollah when it needs to act in Venezuela or in Latin America writ large. And so I think that's what confuses a lot of people, is to try to understand how Hezbollah operates in the region. And my point to that is just to say, Hezbollah doesn't carry business cards. So it's not like when they come to Latin America, we know exactly who they are, but it's the network that lies underneath that provides them the ability to come in and out of Latin America and Venezuela undetected.
Yeah, we have a question for one of our viewers. He's asking, how do you see the day after the regime is taken out? Basically, a free Venezuela. Do you see a new president coming in, or you just see a group of people taking over the country again?
Well, it all depends on how that day after comes to fruition. I mean, if it comes to fruition through an orderly transition, then obviously there's a huge rebuilding effort that's going to have to take place. That has both economic dimensions, but also obviously it's going to have political dimensions, but also it's going to have security concerns. I mean, just because the regime moves from power, it doesn't mean that all these transnational criminal organizations and international terrorist groups are going to just disappear. So it's going to be a challenge no matter what. But I should say this. this is my challenge with the day after planning. There's been a lot of day after planning happening in the United States, in Colombia, in many parts of Latin America, and in the world, really. Europeans even got involved in this to understand how to take Venezuela from kind of the failed state status that it has right now and into some level of prosperity and stability in the future. I think that part is somewhat being flushed out. I mean, there's been smart people that have thought through how to do this in various different scenarios. What hasn't been thought out very carefully isn't the day after scenarios. It's what I call the day before scenarios. How do we get there? I mean, it's all great to have a big plan about what you're going to do the day Maduro leaves, but how do you get Maduro to leave? That's the hard part. And I think what we found out over time is getting rid of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is more difficult than it seems. And so, in that sense, I think the day before planning is equally, if not more important than any day after planning for Venezuela. So I think Rena, I think you hung up again. So let me see if you call back in. And Rena, I was just saying before, I think it hung up, so you might not have heard I'm going to say very briefly, was what I was essentially saying was the day after planning is important, but I think more important at this moment is the day before planning. We need to have a clear strategy of how we're going to get to a transition in Venezuela. And I think that's where so far it turned out to be more difficult than we thought. So the day before planning, I think, is the void that we're missing.
So Joseph, thank you so much, and I hope to see you next time.
Okay, Rena, can I make one little plug to this radio show?
Yes.
Before I go.
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
Just for everyone watching. So yeah, I think most of you might heard me in Spanish and Spanish outlets on CNN or some media in Latin America, and so I do media in English as well. So one of the things we do is I co-host a radio show every Tuesday night on a very popular and respected radio show. It's actually an honor for me to co-host with John Batchelor. For those that aren't familiar with John Batchelor, he is a legend in the radio world. He co-hosts the #1 foreign policy radio show in the United States that's nationally syndicated throughout 60 or 70 radio stations throughout the country. In New York, where it's based, you can catch him every night from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. on 77 WABC on AM, and in Washington, D.C., that's 630 WAML on AM radio. Now, I know radio, not everybody listens to radio these days. Everyone wants podcasts. Well, it's also a podcast on iTunes. You can follow the John Batchelor Show on iTunes or any other Spotify or any other podcast network. I co-host a show every Tuesday at 10 p.m. called is a segment called The New World Report. All we do is talk Latin America for 20 minutes. We talk about Latin America economics, Latin America geopolitics, security, and a lot of that conversation is about Venezuela. I think, matter of fact, we've been doing this segment, The New World Report, since March, and I think every show we've hit on Venezuela because Venezuela is obviously a big part of what's going on in the region. So I invite everybody, if you want to hear my thoughts on a more regular basis, tune in at 10 p.m. Every Tuesday on the John Batchelor Show, or download it the next day on podcast. I'm on every week on that network.
Okay, so I please ask everyone watching this interview to please follow Joseph on Twitter at JM Humire, is Humire. Well, thank you, Joseph, once again, and I will be hearing your program tonight at 10 p.m.
Okay, thanks, Rena. Thanks again for the invitation.